Good morning, everyone. Great to see all of you this morning. Glad that you are here with us to worship today. We're continuing our series called Messy Church, and we're going to be looking today more at liberty. We started that last week, and we're going to continue to look a little more at liberty and how liberty has changed for us. So if you take your Bibles, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and we're going to look at verses 1 to 14 this morning. If you stand with me, please, reverence to the reading of God's Word. Paul writes, "Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If so, of others, I am not an apostle, at least I am to you. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. My defense is those who examine me is this: do we not have a right to eat and drink? Do we not have a right to take along a believing wife, even as the rest of the apostles and the brothers of the Lord Jesus, Lord and Cephas? Or do only Barnabas and I not have a right to refrain from works? Who at any time serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat the fruit of it? Or who tends a flock and does not use the milk of the flock? I'm not speaking these things according to human judgment, am I? Or does not the law also say these things? For it is written, in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing. God is not concerned about oxen, is he? Or is he speaking altogether for our sake? Yea, for our sake. It was written, because the plowman ought to plow in hope, and the thresher to thresh in the hope of sharing the crops. If we sowed spiritual seeds in you, it is too much if we reap. Is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share the right over you, do we not more? Nevertheless, we did not use this right, but we endure all things so that we will cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. Do not you know that those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple? Those who attend regularly to the altar have the Lord, their share from the altar. So also the Lord directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the Lord." Let's bow together in prayer. God, thank you that this is your time. Lord, all of this, from the singing that we've enjoyed, the Lord's Supper, and now a few minutes in your word, God, it's for you. And so I pray that our minds will not be distracted by the things that are happening this afternoon or the things that are happening in the week to come. But Lord, instead, you would just give us a freedom to be able to look at your word and listen to it and understand it. Lord, I just pray that you change us as we do so. Help us to have an encounter with you this morning. In Jesus' name. You may be seated. All right, so I want to ask a question. Do you agree with this statement made by theologian D.A. Carson? He said, "The church does not pay its ministers, rather, it provides them with resources so that they are able to serve freely." In other words, do we give our pastors a salary package, or is our goal to provide for their needs? The first time I went and viewed a call, 23 years old, went to Isola, Mississippi. It's a small town, 500 people probably. And this church, this wonderful church, Liberty Baptist Church, was there. And so we went and viewed a call, we talked with the church, and then the lead deacon took us out to show us the area, which was basically flat. There was all just props everywhere, or catfish ponds, that's all there was at all in that area. But he took us to his farm because he was a huge farmer in the area. And so he took us there, and we're driving along, and all of a sudden he slows down. And he points over to 3 or 4 row houses that are, like shotgun houses that are all side by side. And he said, "Now, preacher, what we've decided is you can pick whichever one you want. And we're going to provide you with chickens, and we're going to help you grow a garden, and we're just going to make sure that your needs are taken care of." Now, for my wife and I, That was not impressive whatsoever. It did not create any desire to want to live in that manner. And I will tell you, he was just playing. He was giggling the whole time he was saying it and laughing, and they took great care of us, actually, as a family, especially as a first church to pastor. Paul's discussion in this chapter is built upon the freedom that he talks about in the last chapter. In chapter 8, Paul talks about physical liberties. Remember last week we talked about the weaker brother and the stronger brother, and the liberty that we have, and how that liberty gets challenged at times because some people can't be free at the moment of an issue that they're dealing with. Now Paul defends his apostolic authority by dealing with more questions from the believers in Corinth. Now, it's interesting because we're having to derive the questions from the answers instead of the other way around. We read the answers and understand what the people were asking. In this situation, they're talking about his authority, and they're questioning it because they're questioning whether or not he's an apostle compared to Peter, or compared to Apollos, or compared to even Barnabas, because he doesn't do what they do. You hear that? He doesn't do what they do. Now, before we go any farther, do you have some pre-described ideas of what a pastor should do? We do sometimes, don't we? We come to the table with our own ideas, our own thoughts about how a pastor should work, or the ministries that they should have. This is where Paul is. He's in a situation where they've begun to comparison shop with apostles. And they're deciding these people are apostles and these are not, because these do this and these don't. And his goal then is to set these people free, to say, look, liberty is no longer what it used to be. It has been changed by the grace and the gospel of Jesus. We can rest in him. We cannot, however, get angry with the church at Corinth, because when you look at statistics when it comes to pastors in the ministry, you learn some interesting things. Just listen to what it says. According to the New York Times, August 1st, 2010, members of the clergy now suffer from obesity, hypertension, and depression at rates higher than most Americans. In the last decade, their use of antidepressants has risen while their life expectancy has fallen. Many would change jobs if they could. As a matter of fact, 1,500 pastors leave their ministries each month due to burnout, conflict, or moral failure. But folks, we're not doing something right if that's even halfway true. There's a problem. There's a disconnect. We've created all these expectations that are unattainable. And Paul's goal, again, is to set us free. Now, this message is not about pastor burnout. It's not about the resources that you provide. You take great care of us as a staff. This is a message about leadership. And the example Paul sets here for us, even as he defends something so important as liberty and his apostolic authority. Kenneth Chafin said this: Paul is using one of the most basic of all principles of leadership. Here it is. He himself practiced in his own life what he preached to others. He practiced in his own life what he preached to others. He continues, the secret of the power and influence of the leaders of the first century wasn't the things they said, but the fact that they were themselves an incarnation of their own message. You see, that is what God has called us to. As pastors, as anyone in this building, God has called us to grab hold of that principle that you cannot say it and then don't do it. You've got to practice what you preach. This morning we want to see that in action and understand how that relates to our liberty. So, first question we have this morning: do we fight for freedom? Do we fight for freedom? Look again at verse 1 in chapter 9. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? And are you not my work in the Lord? Now, those are all rhetorical questions. The answer to all of them is yes. He knows that all that is true. But he wants this messy church to just stop for a minute and consider what they're saying and why they are saying it. You know, it's interesting today that, as was joked about with Miss Pat's filter, but there are many people who have a way worse or way less of a filter than she does, and then many others do. Way worse. Why? Well, we want to express our opinion. We want people to think like we think. We want people to do what we do. And so these people follow that same pattern. They have their opinion, their idea of Paul, and so they seem to determine Paul's apostolic authority or lack thereof by comparing him to other church leaders. If you go back to chapter 1 and verse 12, you remember that there was already a conflict between Apollos and Paul and Peter, that they were dividing themselves, and Jesus, they were dividing themselves between the four and determining, I'm going to follow Paul, I'm going to follow Peter, I'm going to follow Apollos, I'm going to follow Jesus. So they were separating themselves, and now we see this same idea coming back again. Because here are these men. These are what we call apostles. And Paul, you don't match up to that. It's not, you can't call yourself an apostle because this is what an apostle is. They're comparing him to Peter and Apollos specifically because they're called apostles to the scriptures for an ancient manuscripts from that century. He wants them to stop and consider what an apostle actually looks like. And I believe with all my heart that that's what God wants you to do. Especially when it comes to your pastors and leaders within our church. It's not enough, folks, to just stand behind a microphone or have one on your head, like me. Or stand behind a microphone as our singers do. It's not enough just for that. That doesn't make me a leader. Doesn't make Dwayne or Brian, who did a wonderful job with Lord's Supper, doesn't make any of us leaders if we're not living the message that we're preaching. Now, how do you know that I'm living the message I'm preaching? Folks, that means we got to spend time together. That means we got to build relationships. And what that really means, and my wife and I have talked about this many times with our kids, and we've explained to them because Dad's a pastor, because Mom's involved in ministry, that we live in a glass house. And that people are constantly looking in and seeing how we live and what we do and why we do it. That's not just true for me, by the way. That's true for you as well. Because while I'm the pastor at this church, you might be the pastor of your neighborhood. You might be the only Christian in that whole neighborhood who has an opportunity to reach those people for Jesus. And folks, listen, they need to see you in action. Faith at work in your life. Not just, well, I go to church. And not just, I preach a sermon. Or I lead a song. Or I perform, get the Lord's Supper all set and do that. No, that's not enough. You see, this is a message about leadership, and it's time that we stop saying, well, the exterior looks okay, everything sounds all right, so we're good. No, you need to get to know us. My family will be here in 2 weeks. But you need to get to know us. You need to get to understand us, and all our pastors, all our leaders, you need to take the time to build that relationship. We must live our lives in a way that what they hear is what they see, so that God is glorified and His people are edified. So in the end, what is the success of a church? Is it full pews? Is that what it is? Is it meeting the budget every month? No. What's the purpose of the church? Why are we here? Well, success is found in the lives of those who've been radically transformed by the God of this church through the ministries He's placed here. You see, that's what shows our success rate. It's the transformed lives that we see being raised up in this body of believers. So understand again that we must be careful because, again, sometimes we like to comparison shop. I like this church because it does this, but this church does that better. And this church, Listen, our church, any church, it's not just for you. The reality is God's calling some of you to be a part of this church because we need you. We need your ministry. We need your abilities, your gifts. See, that's vital for us to grasp as we think about success within a church. Notice verse 2 that Paul says here. He says, if to others I'm not an apostle, least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. So Paul points directly at these people. And he says, do you want proof that I'm an apostle? You're my proof. You are the seal of my apostleship. Their existence as a church and the transformed lives of the people is all the proof that is needed. So he called them the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. That Greek word for seal, and it translated seal in the New American Standard, is sphragus. And it means certification, validation, or proof. He says, look, you are the proof of my apostolic authority. If you need proof, just look at yourself. See what God has done in you through the ministry that he's given to me. So what's the proof of your ministry? What's the seal or the validation or the certification of the ministry that God has called you to? And by the way, all of us are called to ministry in some way. So are you seeing lives changed by the ministry that you're working in or involved in? Paul wants this messy church to consider his life and determine if it matches up to his message, and then determine his freedoms based upon that. So he says in verses 3 to 10, here is my position. Listen, he says, my defense to those who examine me is this: do we not have a right to eat and drink? Do we not have a right to take along a believing wife, even as the rest of the apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or do only Barnabas and I not have right to refrain from working? Once again, he's talking about, he's giving rhetorical questions. He's saying, hey, can as an apostle, can I drink and eat anything I want to? As an apostle, can I take my wife with me if she's a believer into the ministry? As an apostle, can I refrain from working outside because you're willing to provide the resources I need to work inside the church, to serve there? Of course, the answer is yes. But I want you to notice that he proves it. All right? He doesn't just say it, he wants to prove it. So notice verse 7. He says, who at any time serve as a soldier on his own expense? And who plants a vineyard and does not eat the fruit of it? Or who tends a flock and does not use the milk of the flock? In other words, he's saying, look, the world clearly says that a person who works in a certain capacity should be paid for that capacity, whether it is a soldier or a vineyard owner who partakes of the wine of the vineyard, or a farmer who drinks the milk from his livestock. You see, he says, the world says, yes, you should be free to do those things. But then notice verse 8, the Old Testament also tells us the same thing. He says, I'm not speaking these things according to human judgment, am I? Or does not the law also say these things? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing. God's not concerned about oxen, is he? Or is it he's speaking altogether for our sake? Yea, for our sake it was written, because the plowman ought to plow and hope, the thresher to thresh and hope of sharing the crops. So his desire, his goal here, using Deuteronomy 25:4, is to help them see that not only does the world tell us yes, but also that the Scriptures, the Old Testament Scriptures tell us. Literally, he says, if an ox is threshing grain, don't put a muzzle on it. Why not? Because while he's threshing, he can also partake of some of that and eat some of it along the way. If that's true for an ox, and he says that God cares little for, what about for you and for me? What about his provision for us? So is liberty Paul's greatest concern in ministry? Does he only fight for freedom? The answer is no. Paul loves people, folks. Paul loves people. He loves to see lives transformed by the gospel. And that is what he focuses on. That's where his goals are set. So now he wants to set these people free. Should enjoy the Christian life to the fullest. Not be burdened with legalism or lawlessness. So he fights for freedom. But then the next question is this: do we lead with love? Do we lead with love? Remember, freedom is wonderful in Christ, and there are incredible freedoms that we can enjoy in Jesus. However, we don't lead by our liberties. We lead with love. We lead with love. Notice he continues there in verse 11. If we sow spiritual things in you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share the right over you, do we not more? Nevertheless, we do not use this right, but we endure all things so that we will cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. So what he says here then is leaders should love their people more than their liberty. And he says, if we have planted spiritual seeds, that's such a beautiful picture, isn't it? What's happening right now? We're planting seeds. Little things that you'll take the rest of this week and think about, God will use to encourage you or to change you in whatever way he chooses. Planting seeds. Now, we know that Paul planted seeds in Corinth because he lived there for a year and a half. And so, in being there, he planted lots of seeds. And so he says, if we plant those seeds, if that's the case, then should we not receive material things from you? Now, Paul, like most pastors, is not trying to get rich. He simply wants to pave the way for future church leaders to receive material things for sowing spiritual seeds. This is a freedom. This is a freedom that church leaders should enjoy, but Paul rejected any payment for fear that someone would be offended or reject Jesus because of him. So leaders should love their people more than liberty. He loves souls more than he loves sapphires or rubies or diamonds. He loved people and wanted to see their lives transformed by the gospel. We read earlier Proverbs 11, and specifically verse 30. He says, the fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and he who wins souls is wise. You see, as that tree is constantly reseeding, we must be those people who are placing those seeds, not only by what we say, but in how we live. They need to hear the message and they need to see the message, folks. And if that doesn't happen, we're failing. We're falling short. So it is so important we grasp God's call upon our lives here and the freedom that we can enjoy within that. But then in verses 13 and 14, Paul says people should love their leaders more than legalism. Notice 13, do you not know that those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple? Those who attend regularly to the altar have their share from the altar. So also the Lord directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel. Now, if we're not careful, we create legalistic rules. We create policies. And we, in doing so, actually bind up the ministers of this church. You actually stop them from being free to minister fully to the people. You see, we have to be careful that we don't get legalistic and caught up in what we think has to happen. Several of us from our staff went to a tax meeting a couple of weeks ago just to learn all about taxes for pastors and how to take care of them. And the guy that was teaching would say, something, and we'd all go, why is that? And he'd say, just because somebody made a decision. Somebody said it, so that's why we do it. Folks, we've got someone who said what we need to do, and he's right here. Okay? This is our guidebook, not this. Not my thoughts, not my ideas, not yours, but his. He shows us how to be his church. So he reminds them again that those who serve in the temple or at the altar receive a portion of what is given to take care of themselves and their family. Generosity and genuine love should lead us to meet our leaders' needs so they can stay focused upon the ministry of this church. Legalism destroys generosity. It flushes genuine love right down the toilet. Because we made a rule, and that's that. It's got to be. It literally stunts kingdom growth and steals our freedom. So Paul concludes by just simply saying, listen, if someone is working within the ministry and involved in that ministry, called to that ministry, then they should be provided resources for themselves to do so. When a leader leads in love, then the church should take care of his needs, and so he can take care of their needs. This is what God has called us to. It's a mutual understanding that's predicated by their love for each other. So, how do we grow in love? How do we see our liberty changed? Well, the answer is very simple. We begin to see our lives from the perspective of that glass house. And we begin to say, you know what? We're going to live our lives inside this house and outside this house exactly like we say we are. Exactly as we say. So people can look in and they can see what God is doing and how God is working. They can see it in our kids. They can see it in the home whatsoever, just the home itself. They can see it in all those areas that we are practicing what we preach. We're understanding this is God's call on our life. You want to enjoy liberty in your life? You focus your attention there. Forget about all the liberties you might have, all the things you might do, and let your words and your actions match up. That's what God's calling us to today. That's how we see liberty change. Let's pray.